Thank you for the introduction, Jakari. I really appreciate it. I'm going to introduce myself first, and then when we get to John's turn, I'll introduce him as well. I am the CEO of Zealie. I used to be the CEO of a behavioral health center up until about 4 years ago when I started Zealie to create a billing company that specializes in behavioral health billing. I myself hold the law degree, but I will allow John to discuss any of the legal components of audits. I'm going to focus more on the billing side in this presentation. And thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time to learn about this and understand this. So first, we're going to start out with Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. We're going to focus today mostly on Anthem of California because it would be very difficult to talk about every Anthem and Blue Cross Blue Shield. So we'll primarily focus on Anthem of California. However, Blue Cross Blue Shield is very consistent across the board, but I'm just going to be discussing experiences with Anthem specifically. So we're going to talk about two different types of quote unquote audits. Okay. There's the post-payment review and the prepayment review. They're exactly what they sound like. We'll start with post-payment review. Again, sounds just exactly like what it is. It's having records reviewed after receiving payment, so post-payment. And this can happen in two ways. We've all got medical records requests, I'm sure, after providing services and getting paid for those services. However, the one we're going to focus on is a more formal post-payment review. It's where you receive a letter specifically from SIU, Special Investigative Unit at Anthem in this case. So when you receive this letter, very typical letter that you'll receive is it will ask for records for numerous clients you've had over the years. And some of these records could be incredibly old, 2-3 years old even. I had a client who they came to us, and 1 week after being a client of ours, they informed us they had a letter asking for records for over 50 clients, some of which were over 3 years old. So it could be, quite a few requests on records, and they can be quite old as well. When this happens, do not freak out. Okay, this happens all the time in the industry. It's very important. The first thing you need to do is communicate. Okay. I always tell my clients the second you get that letter, right on the letter, it tells you who the SIU rep is. Email that person, let them know you received the letter, you're working on getting those records. Communication, is so key, being very detail oriented in your communications with them, asking very specific questions. Is incredibly important. With an SIU agent, you can also, if you need extra time, because as I mentioned, it could be quite a few records they're requesting, ask for it. In my experience, they always grant additional time to get all those records together because they know how tedious it could be. And as you know, those records can be incredibly large. So again, it can seem intimidating receiving this letter, but you need to communicate, you need to be on top of it. That's very key. Be very detail oriented. And of course, understand what are the medical necessity requirements for this particular payer, and look at and review your notes and see if you're meeting them. Some of your older notes may not be as good as your most recent notes, right? It happens all the time. We have an account, we've had them for 6 months. So we really get their clinical documentation really great, but then they're asking for things 2-3 years ago. And you look at those and, they may not be that organized or structured. And in that case, oftentimes, again, communication, allow the SIU person to know, listen, in our older notes, the level of care note was missing in some of them, and just let them know. And even adding cover letters and explaining where certain things are has always been incredibly important because you're going to send the records, somebody's going to review them. They don't know where everything is in your record keeping. And also you may have changed where you keep certain information as time has passed. So having that cover letter explaining where things are, and I mean in detail, like you can find the level of care note on page 2 at the base, So for every record you sent, having a detailed cover letter is very helpful. And then, of course, following up with that agent to say, did you receive the records? Has the auditors begun to review them? Have there been any issues? Can we address those issues? What are those issues? So it's about questions and being on top of it. So that's post-payment review. Typically speaking, at least with Anthem of California, what you'll get back is not a request for refund of payment. What you'll get back can lead to what you're trying to avoid, but oftentimes it leads to a prepayment review. So they send you a letter stating, we reviewed your records, and it's our belief that, for a particular level of care, let's say you do detox, RTC, PHP, and IOP, they say for PHP level of care, we feel like you do not meet Anthem's medical records or medical necessity requirements. So we're going to put you in prepayment review for this level of care. That happens. Sometimes they'll isolate one level of care, sometimes two, could be all levels of care, but that's rare. Sometimes it could be no levels of care. Again, that's also rare. Oftentimes they come back and have an issue with one of your levels of care. So then they let you know, okay, now you're in prepayment review. So what does prepayment review mean? That means prior to them paying you, you need to send in the medical records. So every time you submit a claim, you're going to have to send in medical records with that claim. They're going to have to review those medical records and then make a decision on whether you meet Anthem's medical necessity requirements. And of course, at this point, you'll know them quite well because you reviewed them when you did your post-payment review. So your notes should be much better at this point. This prepayment review process can be very painstaking. And I'm not going to lie to you right now, audits are definitely something that has become more common, especially as providers get bigger, they start generating more revenue. These things happen. They want to look at your documentation. So again, I want to emphasize, very important to communicate with them. Let them know, here are the records. We sent them on this date. Follow up. Did you receive them? How are they doing? Have those cover letters where saying things are and explaining things very clearly on those cover letters. Oftentimes you have to make sure you read that letter that they sent carefully, because they could have asked you, oh, don't submit the claims electronically, just print a paper claim and mail it. Make sure you do it how they're asking you to do it. And follow up. One of the issues with Anthem of California is that they, unlike with the rest of their medical requirements, they don't have very clear-cut rules and thresholds to meet, like Optum does. Optum has really clear thresholds to meet, which is 80% records passage rate. And in fact, Anthem's medical side also has that same criteria, but their behavioral health side, it's not as clear. So communication is key. I've actually had a client of mine, we've had such different experiences because the SIU agent, their communication becomes very important. So I've had two clients have had completely different experiences. One had an agent that rarely responded to emails or phone calls. In fact, never responded to a phone call and took their time responding to emails. And we just kept pushing that SIU agent to explain some of the denials because they didn't make sense. And in fact, that one was with a PHP level of care. They were getting a lot of denials. And eventually the agent, without explaining why, let them out of audit. I think it was just due to the fact that he couldn't explain why a lot of those denials were happening. And in fact, we appealed every single one of those denials, and every single one got overturned and paid on appeal. So it just tells you, it's really important the person you're working with on the other side have had a completely opposite experience with another client of mine. Theirs was the detox level of care, had come back saying that they felt they were in prepayment review for that level of care. That SIU agent responded to every email within 24 hours, every phone call within 24 hours. That process went incredibly smoothly. So it just tells you, you can do all you can in the communication side, and you need to keep pushing. If the other side's not communicating, you need to push those communications and make sure they understand you're on top of it. You're paying attention. You're watching what those denial reasons are, and you're pushing back because some of them are incorrect. As I mentioned in that one situation, all of them were incorrect denials. They were all won on appeal. So very important to stay on top of it and make sure your biller, I mean, in that case, we're doing it on behalf of our clients, your biller who knows it best and your clinical team who knows those files the best are the ones that really should be on top of that for you. So that's Anthem. We'll move on to United/Optum.
Hey, Ali, do you mind if I just make 2 comments?
Of course. Go ahead, John.
So just real quick on Anthem, Ali's absolutely correct that unlike Cigna, for example, or even United, where post-payment reviews don't always or may not very often result in a overpayment demand, whereas with Cigna, you can pretty much guarantee it will result in an overpayment demand. Yeah. I do want to say, though, that Anthem, I mean, there is certainly a risk that the result of a post-payment review with Anthem is that there will be an overpayment demand. Just want to emphasize that. And I've definitely seen that. Anthem doesn't typically demand or make an overpayment demand if there's documentation deficiencies. I mean, that's then will just put you into a prepayment review. But if they find something that you've been billing and getting paid for something that Anthem doesn't believe that you're entitled to bill and get paid for. For example, I've seen them go after facilities that were billing and getting paid for physician medical services. And these are non-medical LLCs that are billing that. I've seen Anthem, come back and say, we want all that money back. So just be aware that Anthem certainly will assert overpayments if they find something that is a real significant issue. The other comment I want to make is when you're dealing with the Anthem during prepayment review and you're dealing with the Anthem reviewers, if they're denying claims, absolutely critical to get them on the phone to talk through it, and make sure you're not just dealing with the SIU representative at that point. You want to be speaking with whoever it is at Anthem who's actually reviewing those claims, because that SIU person doesn't typically know what the issues are. So you need to talk to that reviewer and really push that reviewer and have that dialogue and go through the claims and just try showing them that you're on top of it, that they actually, the quicker they're going to want to get you out of the prepayment review. Because they've got a lot on their plate. These reviewers are having to review tons of records. And so if you can sort of give them a good reason to let you out of it, then the reviewer will become your ally and will convince the SIU person to let you go. So anyhow, thank you, Ali.
Yeah, both of those great points. Those are both very accurate. You do have to be careful for that, especially with Anthem of California, the first thing you mentioned regarding those professional services. You definitely need to be on the lookout for that. So anyway, let's move on to United/Optum. So before I get into the actual more formal audit, there is something we call internally the friendly phone call audit. And we've been seeing this kind of started, at least in the state of California, we noticed that it started right around the same time that the incidental medical services licenses came out. And Optum would reach out to the facility and they would say, hey, we just want to catch up with you, and we're going to have some of our clinical people talk to your clinical people just to see how your facility is operating. And it's very nonchalant, it sounds, the call. So it's very, that's why we call it the friendly phone call audit. And so they, don't refuse this, because if you ask them over the phone, what if I refuse to have this? They'll say, we'll flag you for authorizations and we won't authorize certain levels of care if you don't have this call with us. So it's, if you ask that question, you kind of quickly find out it's not as friendly as you first thought it was. So anyway, they get you on the call. It's really involves clinical people. They want your billing person there as well, just to ask questions regarding how do you bill this clinical service and so forth. But most of the conversation revolves around clinical. And early on, when the IMS first came out in California, at least, a lot of the questions were surrounding that. Do you have it? If you don't, at that time, they used to flag you as they won't authorize detox level of care because they felt that to meet Optum's requirements for detox level of care, you had to have IMS. Now it's still required, but now, they ask just because you have the IMS license doesn't mean you meet their detox requirements. It's the minimum threshold to meet their detox requirements. But anyway, so you'll have this phone call, they'll ask certain questions, and after the call, they'll typically send a follow-up letter. And this letter, if they found any issues that they felt at any level of care, again, we're focusing primarily on detox, residential, PHP, and IOP levels of care, they'll say, we're placing a temporary flag and we will not authorize that level of care for you. So obviously, like I said, it wasn't that friendly of a call. However, there's two things you need to note here. One, it says temporary, and two, they spell out in that letter why they believe that you don't meet Optum's medical necessity requirements. This quote unquote audit is very easy to get out of, to be honest with you. All you need to do is follow up with that person immediately and tell them, oh, okay, we saw what you said, whether you agree with them or not. You can show them why you don't agree. Oh, actually, we do meet these criteria. You just didn't understand what we were saying, and you show them that. Or you say, okay, well, we'll alter our P&Ps to make sure that we do, and you send them that to that person that sent you that letter. Typically speaking, within a few weeks, they're going to lift that flag, and you're back to getting authorization for that level of care. Now, again, communication, very important, staying on top, understanding what they're saying is lacking, and then meeting that requirement and letting them know you meet that requirement. And then, of course, following up and saying, as you can see, we meet that requirement now. They will lift that flag. I have seen people not realize that it's a very simple thing to get through. I've had a client come to us saying that they were in audit with Optum for over a year and a half. When we called in, they weren't actually in any type of formal audit. They simply had this flag on their account for a year and a half at a particular level of care. And we were able to get out of it in 2-3 weeks, right? We were like, oh, you just need to follow up, let them know you're not actually audited. This is a temporary flag on one particular level of care. You just needed to communicate. Their previous biller apparently hadn't known this. So not a big deal, but keep an eye out for it. Understand you need to communicate with them, let them know you meet their requirements, and then have that flag lifted immediately. So that's the friendly phone call audit that we refer to. Then they have a much more formal process similar to Anthem's process that we just talked about regarding post-payment review, where you'll receive a letter from PNI, that's their version of SIU, requesting certain records from the past. Again, just like the Anthem situation, they are going to ask for some older records, which may or may not be as good as your most recent records, right? And as clear. So those cover letters, again, are very important. That communication is very important. When it comes to post-payment review with Optum, it's very similar in my experience with Anthem's. It's about communication, those cover letters, constantly following up, asking about the auditor, asking to speak to the auditor if you disagree, just like John said, and that was a great point John made. So the post-payment review acts very much like Anthem, which we already discussed. The prepayment review with Optum is actually, I prefer it, right? If they come back and they say a particular level of care, they believe you need to send in medical records because they flagged you, quote unquote, for that level of care, just to make sure you're meeting those medical necessity requirements for that level of care. Typically speaking, we've had great experiences with all the PNI agents. They're very communicative. So don't freak out. Okay. Again, with all of these, don't freak out. You have to take them, handle them step by step. There's a process. There's a way to get through them. And so getting angry and freaking out, those aren't going to help. Walking through the process and having your biller work with you and your clinical staff to make sure they get everything to the payer and are following up with the payer is very important. So Optum actually reviews the records, in my experience, pretty quickly, and they review them, they get them paid. Again, you're getting paid with the Anthem and with the Optum throughout the process, right? On the claims that get accepted and meet medical necessity, they're paying you. So it's not like they're denying every claim. With Optum, it's much more systematic. You can if you meet that 80% passage, as long as you ask for them to review, you say, hey, can you, after a few months, you ask, can you review our passage rate? And if you exceed 80%, you're out of audit, right? If you're lower than 80%, they'll let you know. You can ask for an education at that point, and they'll actually get on the phone with you and say to you why certain records didn't pass. And I actually did one of these, and where they were saying, oh, there was a level of care mismatch. And it was simply because when the facility was admitting someone, they were admitting them to detox / residential. But if you look just lower, they would say detox, and then they would say residential in order. So it was just the auditor was, the way they were reading it was just unclear. So they just changed the way it was phrased on that one page, and within a few weeks they were out of audit. They had a 76% passage rate, and all of the denials were because of this simple front page issue. And then once it was fixed, they were out of audit very quickly. Much more formal process than the Anthem process. So this one, you have to make sure, A, ask for that review so they can tell you your passage rate, your record passage rate. And two, if you don't get the, don't meet the 80% passage rate, ask for that education. And that'll be an eye-opening experience. Sometimes it could be something incredibly small that's easy to fix and you're immediately out. So definitely a different experience there with the prepayment review component of Optum than with Anthem in that regard. So in the next one, we're going to talk about Cigna. I'm going to be passing Cigna off in a second to John because he's the guy I have worked with on these a few times, and he's the guy I call whenever these come up. So the post-payment review with Cigna, again, very similar to Anthem and Optum. You'll receive a letter in the mail. They will request a bunch of records, could be very old, could be a lot of them. And you'll send them in. This is what is different. You'll send them to Cigna, and then some time will pass. Some significant time will pass. Sometimes over a year will pass. And you'll think, oh, everything's great. Everything's hunky-dory. My records must have been great. They haven't heard back. They're paying me. Everything's working fine. And then all of a sudden you get a second letter, and that second letter arrives, and everything wasn't hunky-dory. They've decided that not only do they feel that some of them, right, this doesn't happen every time, but it happens quite often, and I'll let John fill you in more on that, where they say, this one deficiency exists. We noticed it in every single record you sent. Not only would we like, potentially the money back on these records or a percentage of these records, we're going to assume that all of your claims have the same deficiency or this percentage, 70%. If 70% of the records you sent had that deficiency, if it was 100%, they'll say 100% of your claims. So therefore, we want all the money back we've ever paid you, or a percentage of all the money. And it could be a big, scary number. So again, this could be a scary moment. Don't freak out. Also, they'll put a flag on your account until the quote unquote, the dispute is settled. So you won't be able to take Cignas while you're dealing with this when the second letter arrives. So the second letter, the reason it says time to call a lawyer is because, and the reason I invited John to be the guest speaker here is because he's the lawyer I tell all my clients to call when this happens, because he's had a ton of experience with this. And I've even done, been with him in the room while he's been advocating for a client of his. So let me tell you a little bit about John. John's a partner at Nelson Hardiman. He's a co-chair of their litigation practice. He attended law school at University of Texas. He's a member of the American Bar Association. And as I said, he's the guy I call when these come up. In fact, I was in one with him where he was talking to the people on the other side at the site visit. And he's done, I've done a few of these. He's done quite a few more where he literally said to them, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. And I thought he was joking and he was serious. They were going to go to another facility tomorrow. So that's why I know he's the guy to call in these situations. So without any further ado, let me introduce John Mills of Nelson Hardiman.
Thank you, Ali. Those are kinder words than I deserve. And I suppose if there was a if I could get a legal specialization in Cigna audits, I guess I would. I don't think where one exists, but I certainly have done a number of them over the years, both with the mental health and substance use disorder treatment clients, but also just going back into many years ago with surgery center clients and physician groups and other types of providers. So yeah, they're very familiar with their strategies. Before I get started, I do need to remind everyone watching that I am not providing legal advice to you or your organization through this presentation. The views that I express during this presentation are my personal ones and are for informational purposes only. Please consult your legal counsel regarding any specific issues that you or your organization may have. So as Ali said, with Cigna, yes, they start off like everybody else with the records request letter, and it's pretty generic. There's a few issues that I'll talk about that are specific to that letter you'll get, which are a little bit unique to Cigna. I'll talk about that in a minute. But then yes, more often than not, if you receive a records request from Cigna, then you can expect to receive a demand letter from Cigna at some point in the future, whether it's 6 months down the road or even a year down the road. But they will come back and they will, most likely than not, demand that you return every last penny that Cigna's ever paid you from the inception of the audit period to the present. And as Ali was saying, what they do is they extrapolate. They look at the audit period, and then if they've been paying you since the close of that audit period for a year, let's say a year's gone by, they're gonna state that they assume that the deficiencies they found during the audit period are continuing and ongoing, and therefore they're extrapolating, and so you must pay them back every single penny that they've ever paid you. And what's kind of interesting about this letter is Cigna will not call it an overpayment. Rather, Cigna will allege that it has been damaged by you, which of course is intended to scare you and imply that Cigna will bring a fraud lawsuit against you through which it will seek to recover damages. So they really are kind of right off the bat, making it sound like this is not your typical overpayment letter, but this is a demand, a pre-litigation demand. That's how it feels. That's how it reads. The other thing that Cigna will do is put a flag on your facility that's tied to the facility's location and tax ID number, and this will cause any claim that you submit to Cigna to be automatically denied. My opinion is that they do this to force you to respond, because the likelihood of Cigna actually instituting a lawsuit against your organization, it may be remote. It may actually be quite remote unless the alleged damages are very, very high. And got to keep in mind, $1 million to Cigna may not be a lot of money. I mean, Cigna is a huge organization. So are they going to file a lawsuit over Cigna over $1 million? They might. And I certainly don't want to tell anybody, lead anybody to think that they won't. But you kind of have to do the law of averages. Are they really going to file a lawsuit over that? Maybe not. But they will flag you and they won't pay you. And as a result of that, that's their stick. That's how they get people to respond, because people are looking at the money they're losing by not being able to admit Cigna members. And again, the threat of litigation is not to be taken lightly. Cigna has definitely filed civil lawsuits to recover overpayments, and they might seek additional damages and penalties if they can utilize a statutory false claims theory. And at the risk of going on a tangent on that, I do want to just also emphasize that if you get a overpayment demand from Cigna or from any other payer, frankly, you need to look carefully at what's being alleged as a deficiency. Because if it's some issue that just is pervasive and systemic across your organization, and ultimately the payer's right that they were not required to pay that money, and you were not allowed, or you were not permitted legally to retain that money, then you might have a larger issue on your hands, in the sense that it's possible a false claims statutory false claims theory could be asserted against you by some relator, by a disgruntled employee, for example, who decides to go to the Department of Insurance. And there's a little known provision in the law that says if you, and this is, by the way, not just unique to health insurance, this is any insurance. If you find out that you've been paid insurance benefits to which you're not entitled to, and you know that you're not entitled to it, if you hold on to that money and don't self-disclose it and return it, that itself then creates a statutory false claim. And this is mirrored after the Federal False Claims Act, where the federal government's paying money to contractors, for example, in Medicare. And if you hold on to that money and you know that you're not entitled to it, then you've got a bigger problem on your hands. So you always need to think about that, at least when you get overpayments asserted against you by Cigna or any payer, because if it's a big problem, it's a big pervasive issue, then you need to think about whether there's a larger can of worms that can be opened up on this. And by the way, with Cigna, if they have any evidence that you are engaged in a scheme of healthcare fraud, then there is a real risk that Cigna will refer the matter to regulatory and law enforcement agencies. We've seen criminal prosecutions brought that began with Cigna SIU audits. So this is all the more reason why you don't want to blow off a Cigna audit or really, for that matter, any SIU audit or P&I audit. So how do we prepare for a Cigna audit? I think the best way is to understand the common issues that Cigna focuses on when it conducts an audit. The first indication that you're being audited will usually be a written request for records, as Ali discussed. This records request will not give you much information as to the issues that Cigna is focused on. Months later, more likely than not, when you receive the damages letter from Cigna, this letter will provide more information about the alleged deficiencies. And furthermore, Cigna will mention in that letter that there's a more detailed report out there that you can have access to if you sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I typically allow my clients to sign those NDAs, but I do recommend that you have legal counsel review that NDA before you sign it. I usually allow it to sign, but with some tweaks to the language. But once you get once you sign that NDA, then Cigna will then provide you with a more detailed report. They used to use an outside company called Prest that would do all their records reviews. I'm not sure if they're still using Prest. Lately, I haven't seen a report by Prest, but at any rate, it's a more detailed review than what the damages letter will provide. And in the most common issues that I see Cigna focus on, oh, by the way, sorry, Ali, you should move to the next slide. I apologize.
Got it.
Okay. So the most common issues that I see Cigna focus on are listed on this slide, and whether you're out of network or in network, these are issues that Cigna will definitely focus on when they conduct an audit. And I just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of these, but I do want to draw your attention to the fifth bullet point, non-compliance with medical necessity criteria. So invariably, Cigna will allege that you are not in alignment or not in compliance with its medical necessity criteria. And this is a document you can find online, which provides a lot of detail about Cigna's expectations for residential and outpatient mental health and substance use disorder treatment. And if you are not already familiar with this criteria, then the single most important takeaway from my presentation is that you should get a copy and review it. This will definitely be a worthwhile use of your time in preparing for a Cigna audit and getting through a Cigna audit, as we'll talk about in a minute. Now, there are some interesting discussions to be had regarding whether these criteria are legally enforceable, especially in light of recent class action litigation against United Healthcare and changes to the mental health parity laws. And those are all fascinating issues that I don't have time to get into right now. But nonetheless, putting all those issues aside, you should be familiar with the medical necessity criteria that Cigna publishes. It's not hard to find. In fact, I believe Ali, after this presentation, will send a follow-up that contains a link where you can find it. And if you just Google Cigna medical necessity criteria, maybe mental health, put that in a Google line, you're going to find it. The other bullet point I want to mention real briefly is, obviously Cigna, like all payers, they're looking at documentation to see whether your documentation supports medical necessity. They're seeing whether it supports the level of care that you're billing. One thing about Cigna, and this might actually, maybe the other payers focus on this as well, but I've definitely seen Cigna put a lot of emphasis on this lately, is if you are billing PHP while the patient is still at a residential level of care, Cigna is going to jump all over that issue. Now, I know that was a fairly common practice some years ago, and maybe still a common practice today. And I understand the rationale why people claim that it's okay to do that. You're essentially you need to keep the person at a residential level. The insurance company's not giving you're not extending the authorization, and so for the best interest of the patient, you just go ahead and keep them at residential. And you're billing at a lower level of care, so ultimately the insurance company's paying less money for a higher level of services. So where's the harm in that? And in my personal view, not a bad argument at all. But from Cigna's point of view, that's just outright fraud. If you're billing a level of care that you're not providing, even if you're providing a higher level of care, as far as they're concerned, that's an outright intentional misrepresentation. And I don't know for a fact, but I've heard that Cigna is gone after providers in litigation and has actually tried to get law enforcement to bring criminal cases when they find a pervasive pattern of that happening. So something to be very aware of, something that Cigna is very focused on. Next slide, please. So I said earlier that when you receive Cigna's letter requesting records, you probably won't know what issues they are auditing. But one issue they always audit is patient financial responsibility. Again, doesn't mean other payers don't look at this, but Cigna is very aggressive on this issue. Their records request will expressly ask for copies of evidence that you are billing and making efforts to collect deductibles and coinsurance and balance bill amounts from your patients. And Cigna has for many years aggressively gone after providers that they believe engage in a widespread practice of waiving patient financial responsibility. Cigna has sort of led the charge in litigating this issue. Obviously, Cigna and maybe Aetna, but Cigna has litigated this issue for several decades. There's a case going back into the late 90s that Cigna brought that they took to the Federal Court of Appeal on this issue, and they've prevailed. They prevailed in some key cases. They've established some key legal precedents in this area. And in one relatively recent decision out of Texas, Cigna got the Federal Court of Appeal to agree that insurance coverage under a Cigna ERISA policy is excluded where the provider does not attempt to collect from the patient. So the bottom line is that if you're not making good faith efforts to collect from patients, then Cigna will likely assert this as a basis for damages in recouping funds from you. So it is important that in preparing for a Cigna audit, you take a close look at your policies and practices when it comes to billing and collecting from patients. You want to make sure that any discounts to patients are based on a legitimate financial need that is well documented on a case-by-case basis. And furthermore, if you're using fee forgiving or discounts to induce patients to come to your program, in other words, if that's part of your marketing strategies, then you've got a bigger problem on your hands than Cigna, because that most likely would be construed as a violation of the 2018 federal ECRA law, which again, we could do a whole separate presentation on that, but that's essentially a anti-kickback law. That's a federal law that applies to private plans and is specific and is targeted at the mental health and substance use disorder treatment industry. And Cigna, when they conduct these audits, while it may not look like it on the face of things, they are definitely looking for violations of ECRA, and they may very well refer to the feds, violations that they find. And the feds, by the way, are aggressively enforcing this new law. So, I mean, my firm has been contacted by a number of providers who have run into some problems with the ECRA law. So definitely be aware of that. Next slide, please. So here's just a few tips for surviving the dreaded Cigna audit. First, if Cigna opens an audit on your organization, I recommend that you at least inform your legal counsel. You might not need to get counsel actively engaged just when you receive the records request, but it's a good idea for your legal counsel to at least be aware that you're under a Cigna audit so that they can decide whether or not there are issues that require their immediate review and opinion. I often get asked by out-of-network providers whether they are even required to cooperate with Cigna in an audit. And legally speaking, there's definitely a case being made that out-of-network providers are under no obligation to cooperate. But for reasons I won't get into right now, my personal view is that it is much better long-term to cooperate. That's just you're going to have a better outcome in the long term if you do cooperate, at least at the outset in providing records.
I agree with that, John. I would definitely go.
I mean, if you just blow it off and just ignore them, then they're going to implement the flag anyhow. They're just going to say, all right, well, we assume that all of our concerns are validated, and we're going to flag you. And they just they're not just going to go away, unfortunately. All right. If the audit results in Cigna seeking to recoup money, alleging damages, one of the issues you have to consider is whether to negotiate a resolution or to tell Cigna to essentially go jump off a cliff. As I mentioned earlier, Cigna's stick is the flag. They'll just stop paying you. Every claim will be automatically denied, including patients who you might currently have admitted. And you'll need to determine at that point whether it makes more sense, from a business matter, does it make more sense to negotiate a settlement, which generally will involve you paying back some money to Cigna, or to simply stop being able to admit Cigna members altogether. And that's a business decision which will be driven obviously large part by the amount of money that Cigna is by the negotiation and how that resolves, and also by what Cigna's expectations and demands are for changing the alleged deficiency, a corrective action plan, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute. So at any rate, if you're going to negotiate, though, you should immediately compile a detailed list of any outstanding claims that you have with Cigna, because that you'll need to decide whether to make that part of the negotiation and to essentially turn this overpayment matter into a global resolution with Cigna of all outstanding claims, both claims that they're alleging against you as well as claims that you might have to allege against them. And when you respond to this damages letter, look, there's nothing that says you have to treat it as a formal appeal. In fact, I think Cigna probably takes the position that you don't have any formal appeal rights in response to this letter. But I actually think that's incorrect. I think under ERISA, if these are ERISA claims, ERISA policies at issue, I think you do have formal appeal rights. And frankly, I think that you have those rights under California law. But I strongly recommend that you make your appeal comprehensive, well organized, and persuasively written. I think it shows Cigna that you have put time and attention and thought into what they're alleging, and that it sends a signal that if you had to litigate, you feel that there's strength in your position. So again, litigation may not be a desirable strategy at all, but at least sends a signal that you are capable of litigating these issues and going to the mat on them. Next slide, please. Okay, so one thing about Cigna that is a bit unique is that as part of a settlement negotiation with them, they will want to interview the clinical and billing staff. And they also want to admit other administrative staff. They want to interview the owner. They want to interview the admitting people. Anybody who's the head of marketing, they'll typically want to talk to them. That's usually, for me, the flag that is they're interested in seeing whether there's any ECRA issues going on. Because why else are they asking about marketing? And it's unique because actually pre-pandemic, they would come and do these on-site meetings. And I've yet to experience any other insurance company that will sort of, ask to come and meet you in person and tour your facility and meet your staff. And I actually, think that overall it's a helpful process. I've not once have I ever, had a situation where my client said, no, we do not want Cigna coming on site. My clients typically are a jump at the opportunity. They say, okay, yeah, this is, we believe in what we do. We think we do good work. We're confident that if Cigna comes out, they're going to be impressed. And this is going to go a long ways in resolving the dispute. And I think it definitely expedites the process. Now, unfortunately, right now with pandemic, they're not doing on-site meetings, but they are doing virtual meetings, Zoom meetings, and it gives you the opportunity to talk about the good work you're doing, and it's them asking questions, but it's not a deposition. It's not like you're under oath or anything. It's a kind of informal chat, and it kind of allows a chance to sort of humanize everything. And so I think overall it's a good process, and I actually think that Cigna is doing the right thing by, as scary as they can be, they're doing the right thing by doing that. But you need to prepare for that. Obviously, you definitely do not want to step into one of these meetings without any preparation. And by the way, doing that detailed, lengthy appeal letter, that will help you prepare for this meeting in a large way. That's one of the reasons why I think it's important to do that appeal, that lengthy, thoughtful appeal letter. The other thing about by the way, if you don't have these meetings though without signing a non-disclosure agreement with Cigna that will essentially protect the discussions that occur during these meetings, will protect them as settlement negotiations. You want them to be considered settlement negotiations just in case litigation does happen. Then, and I haven't had experiences yet, but hopefully you could make a good case that, hey, anything that we disclose to Cigna as part of that on-site meeting, it's all privileged settlement discussions, and they can't use it as evidence in a lawsuit, and vice versa. Obviously, anything that they disclose to you, you wouldn't be able to use as evidence either. So, but I think overall, it's better to keep those discussions as settlement discussions. The other thing about getting through a Cigna audit is they will want a written corrective action plan. So that'll be part of any settlement, will be that you essentially have a written document that where all the deficiencies that they've alleged are listed in one column, and you'll need to propose to Cigna how it is that you are going to correct those deficiencies and how you are going to audit yourself to make sure that those deficiencies remain corrected. So that's just part of the negotiation, part of the discussion, and that'll be part of your analysis of whether or not you want to ultimately settle with Cigna, because you might find that some of the things that they are expecting you to do as a corrective action are just not feasible. They're just not monetarily or practically feasible for you to do, and so you're just better off not dealing with Cigna anymore. So that's a decision that each facility has to make on a case-by-case basis. And then, of course, another option to consider is litigation. And, sometimes it makes sense to preemptively sue Cigna. That's going to be, in my personal view, that's going to be a situation where Cigna owes you a lot of money. They've been denying your claims for a long time, and suddenly they're flagging you. That's going to be a situation where you need to strongly consider litigation, but you'd never take the litigation option off the table. It's something that should always be considered as a possible resolution. So, next slide, please, Ali.
I pulled it up. I did want to just comment that that appeal letter, your response letter, is really important to address each one of the issues that they bring up, especially the clinical ones. Having your clinical staff review it and responding to those has really shown historically, in my experience, and I'm sure John, again, has more experience, that you're taking it seriously, you understand what they're saying, and that your response is very thoughtful and thought out. And a lot of those claims that they make, and John knows this, are refutable with the clinical documentation. So that appeal of their original letter is incredibly important from a clinical standpoint as well, making sure clinicians.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't think for a minute that when you get into a negotiation with Cigna, that you're simply just trading numbers back and forth. At some point, you will get, it could get to that point, but initially, the issues, the things that they're alleging, the deficiencies, they want to talk about those issues, and they expect you to talk about those. And so you can't just sort of pretend that the issues that they're alleging are just all irrelevant. You've got to address them in some way. Okay, last slide is, in terms of preparing and surviving a Cigna audit, is be proactive in your preparation. The best preparation for any audit, whether it's Cigna or another payer, is to literally prepare for an audit. Just like you would prepare for an audit or investigation by DHCS when they're coming into, as part of a licensing application or renewal. You need to be prepared for this. And so, avoid risky practices. I mean, we've touched on some of those today, and we certainly can talk about that more offline. And there's plenty of great presentations being put on by great people out there about what are the risky practices that are being the targets of investigations and audits, and you should be educating yourself on all that. Pay attention to the payers' evolving guidelines. Cigna, like I mentioned, they publish them out online. Optum does the same thing. I mean, it's not necessarily that easy to find these things, but they're out there. And if you're in network, then yes, it's easy because they're typically going to provide them to you. If you're out of network, you've got to look for them. And that's one of the tricks of surviving as an out-of-network provider is looking for and educating yourself on the payers' guidelines, which are often changing and evolving. Good documentation practices, obviously that's sort of an obvious one, but I've never experienced any payer audit that did not involve documentation issues, and I think as an industry, documentation is certainly improved. There's great EMR programs out there now, but it's something that you need to stay on top of. You've got to be really emphasizing that to your staff, in your clinical staff and billing staff, the importance of careful, thorough, detailed documentation. Self-auditing of claims. I mean, that's just I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If you're submitting a lot of claims, you should occasionally be looking at what those claims are. What do the claims look like, and are they supported by your medical documentation? And then lastly, develop a compliance program. Again, I don't have the time to discuss that in detail, but I do want to just quickly state that a good compliance program for any healthcare facility involves basically 7 elements, and I'm not making these up. These are actually what the federal government, the OIG, recommends as a compliance program. But they involve written policies and procedures, having a designated compliance professional, having effective staff training on policies and procedures, effective communication within the organization about compliance issues, ongoing self-auditing, enforcement, making sure that that means making sure there's accountability, don't turn a blind eye to violations, and promptly responding and promptly investigating both violations or potential violations. If there's allegations, implied or direct, those need to be taken seriously and promptly reviewed. So with that, I am going to hand it over back to Ali. Thank you everyone for your time and listening to this presentation.
John, thank you so much for that. We're going to have Jakari go through some of the questions, a couple of the questions. If there's any additional questions that need to be asked, feel free to email either myself or John. Our emails are right here on the screen. We'll also send you a recording of this presentation so you can review it. But yes, you can reach out to us if your questions aren't answered. Jakari's going to do a couple, and he'll send some of the questions to us after, and we can email you the responses as well. Jakari, go ahead and ask a couple of the questions that came through during the...
Sure. So the first question I'll direct to you, Ali. It's from Lori Ferens, and she's asking, I have a client who had Cigna EAP. Does Cigna audit EAP charts?
So that's a very good question. Cigna I'm just going to say it. Cigna audits whatever Cigna wants to audit. So the question is, from a legal perspective, can they? That'd be more of a John question. But Cigna, if they ask for medical records, you should be providing those records. I can. Sorry, let me rephrase. I cannot legally answer a question like that. So that one's more for a John question there. No.
I think Cigna's position is that it can, because if assuming this is a member, I mean, if they're auditing the charts of somebody who's a member of Cigna, I think Cigna position is that they can. It's funny, I don't think I've ever run into this issue, and that might be in part because my clients have just either provided those records right out of the gate, and just never came up as something to be debated, or either Cigna's not asked for that. But I think that it's going to boil down to whether Cigna's audit fits within the statutory exceptions, both whether it's HIPAA or the 42 CFR Part 2. But payers have, there's definitely they have a lot of latitude in seeking records. And Cigna's letters, the records request letters, and probably most payers will usually say that. I mean, they'll usually say how there's explicit exceptions in the law to give them the ability to obtain records and review them. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but hopefully it does.
Yeah, I've never had it come up either, John. So either they've never received the letter or they sent the records, and I honestly don't know in that regard. So it seems like a rare situation, something that would need to be looked into and have legal counsel look into it. Do you have another one?
Yeah, there's one more question for John. How do providers generally come on the radar of these payers? What are best practices to avoid coming on their radar?
Well, I mean, the cynical view would be that everybody's going to come onto their radar. Like it's just, it's just a matter of time. Like you're on their radar because if you're out of network and you are providing mental health services, neither of which insurance companies like to pay for, then you're on their radar. And that's a cynical, view, but possibly a very accurate one. The other sort of common, wisdom is that if suddenly they see a major uptick in claims from a particular provider, that's going to get you flagged. And I think that's true. I mean, I think they've got pretty sophisticated systems, a lot of data analytics, and if suddenly there's some tax ID number that they notice there's just this spike in payments that are going to, then that's going to get, the system is going to flag it, and eventually at some point it's going to get to their SIU person. So I really can't answer the question because I don't really know. I mean, you have to ask that question to somebody who works for an insurance company's SIU, and I feel like it's kind of a closely guarded secret, but I do think that volume will get you flagged. I mean, there's always the complaint that gets, the phone call that the insurance companies get from a disgruntled patient or former employee who gives them some hot tip. I mean, I've seen that happen a few times. But more often than not, I think it's volume. They see high charges or an unusually high volume of claims over a short amount of time. That's what gets you flagged.
In my experience, again, there's no hard line rule or anything like that. Definitely, the larger you are, the more money you make, the more claims you're putting in. Definitely seems to draw more attention from payers, generally speaking, because they want to know kind of who you are. Who is this facility that we're paying all this money to, right? And I do want to mention, being in network doesn't make you immune. Certainly, I've seen statistically lower percentage, but it definitely does not make you immune to these audits. So I don't want people thinking, if I go in network, that's going to protect me.
I've handled a lot of in-network disputes. They will definitely audit providers as well.
So a lot of people think that's a way to get off the payer's radar, and maybe to a certain extent, but it's no shield. I can tell you that much.
Okay, great. And we have one final. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, do you have another one, Jakari?
Yeah, one final question from Barbara Hall. She's asking, can you charge some of the copay and they owe the rest? Can you charge some of the copay and they owe the rest?
I'm interpreting the question as meaning, can you charge some of the copay to the patients and then balance bill them for the rest? So, well, I'll just tell you that, from Cigna's perspective and certain other payers' perspective, you should be charging or billing the patient for everything that the insurance company's not paying, unless there's like no coverage at all, right? But if the insurance company pays, it's a $100 claim, and the insurance company pays $50, the expectation is that if you're charging $100, then you are then going to balance bill that patient for the other $50, because if you would not have charged $100 to the insurance company unless you expected to get paid $100. That's sort of the core of their theory, which is not something that Cigna made up. It's actually Medicare, written in Medicare law, that if you're charging $100 and then you get paid $50 from the insurance company and then turn around and just collect $20 from the patient, then your $100 charge is not really a true charge. It's not. You had no expectation of getting paid $100. So I'm not sure I really quite understand the question, but yeah, if you're dealing with Cigna, you need to, your expectation is to charge everything to the patient. Collections is a whole other story, and whether you got to send a person to collections and all that, that's a whole other discussion. But in terms of what you're billing to them, you should be billing it all.
Yeah. And just to be clear, John was answering that as if you're an out-of-network provider. Obviously,
right? Correct.
You're limited to deductible and co-insurance, copay.
Yeah, if you're in network, yes, that's absolutely right. If you're in network, then you can't balance bill, and that's you're only allowed to collect the cost sharing amount from the patient, and then you can't balance bill. That's the contract you have for being in.
And oftentimes, just so you guys know, you may have entered into a third-party arrangement through like a multi-plan or reverse or anything like that also limits you on what you can collect from the patient. So please be aware of that when you bill the patient. A lot of your claims will be negotiated through third-party administrators, and those third-party administrative agreements can often read, and most likely read, like in-network contracts, and that they limit you to simply the deductible.
That's right. That's right. And if you're getting audited on this issue, the payer is asking for records on your patient financial responsibility collection practices. And if you have that situation, you want to definitely tell the payer about that. Don't assume that they know that you've got some multi-plan agreement. So definitely let them know.
They don't know. I would say more often than not, or at least they didn't notice that you were in a third-party arrangement that governed most of the claims you submitted. So I've seen that where simply the payer was not even aware that the TPA was governing almost every single payment that they paid to the provider. So, okay, so we're over time. Thank you so much, John, again, for being here. Thank you for everyone else for attending. If there's any questions we didn't answer, we'll try and get to them. Feel free to email us, like I said, at info@Zealie or jmills at Nelson Hardiman with any additional questions you may have. We'll try and answer them. If you have any billing questions not related to audits, feel free to reach out to us and ask about that, and any legal questions for John. John's not just an audit expert. He does a lot of other things. So
yeah, I'm a healthcare lawyer. I represent healthcare providers, but yeah, we do. I mean, our firm, we're a full service firm for healthcare providers. So we handle all sorts of issues, including transactional, regulatory, all that stuff.
So any additional questions you may have from billing outside the scope of an audit, feel free to ask me. Any legal questions outside of the scope of an audit, feel free to ask John. Thank you again for joining us. And John, really appreciate having you. Always insightful.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you
for having me. Appreciate it very much.
Of course. Have a good one, everybody.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.